Red West noticed something impossible. Every single night for 7 years, Ace Frehley's silver Corvette would leave his Connecticut mansion at exactly midnight. The odometer showed he drove precisely 47 miles, but Ace always returned alone, his Space Ace makeup smeared with tears. Red kept this secret for 40 years. Now he's finally ready to reveal where the spaceman went and why it haunted him until his final performance. It was the winter of 1979 when Red first noticed the pattern. He was staying at Ace's Connecticut estate, helping coordinate security for the upcoming Dynasty tour. The New England cold made sleeping difficult, and around midnight, Red got up to check the perimeter. As he passed by the window overlooking the circular driveway, he saw Ace's custom silver Corvette pulling through the iron gates. Ace was alone behind the wheel, which was unusual. The spaceman rarely went anywhere without at least one roadie or security member. Red thought nothing of it at first. Maybe Ace couldn't sleep. Maybe he needed to drive and clear his head after another explosive argument with Gene Simmons about creative control. But the next night, at exactly the same time, Red heard the familiar rumble of the Corvette's engine. He looked out the window again. There was Ace, alone, driving away into the darkness, his silhouette unmistakable even without the silver makeup. This time, Red checked his watch. Midnight. Exactly. Before we continue this story, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold stories from rock and roll's golden age. By the fourth night, Red's curiosity transformed into genuine concern. He started asking around carefully, not wanting to invade Ace's privacy, but needing to know if anyone else had noticed. Paul Stanley, during a rare phone call about tour rehearsals, gave Red a cryptic response when asked if he knew about Ace's midnight drives. "Yeah, we know something's going on," Paul said quietly. "Been happening since '73, maybe earlier. Don't ask him about it. He won't talk about it. Not even to Gene." Red pressed further. "Does Jeanette know where he goes?" Paul's voice dropped even lower. "She knows he goes somewhere. She told us to let him be. Said he needs this, whatever it is." Even Ace's regular driver didn't know the destination, because Ace always insisted on driving himself during these midnight expeditions. The mystery consumed Red for weeks. Every night, like clockwork, Ace would slip out at midnight and return around 2:45 in the morning. His eyes were always red when he came back, but not from alcohol or drugs. It looked like he'd been crying. Red had worked security for KISS since 1975, and he'd never seen Ace like this. Vulnerable, secretive, carrying some invisible weight that even the Space Ace persona couldn't hide. One night in early February, Red made a decision that would change everything he thought he knew about the spaceman. He waited in his car near the Suttoitsik gate until he heard Ace's Corvette start, then followed at a safe distance with his headlights off. He felt like he was betraying Ace's trust, but something told him this was important. Something told him Ace might need help, even if he wouldn't ask for it. Ace drove south through Connecticut, passing through wealthy neighborhoods with their pristine colonial homes, then middle-class areas with their modest ranches, and finally into the struggling sections of Bridgeport. The streets got narrower, the houses more worn down, graffiti marking brick walls. Red kept his distance, staying several car lengths back, navigating by the Corvette's distinctive taillights. Finally, Ace pulled up in front of a tiny, weathered house in a neighborhood that clearly struggled with poverty. The house was barely standing, paint peeling in long strips, but the porch light was on, as if expecting someone. Red parked 2 blocks away and watched through binoculars. Ace sat in his Corvette for several moments, as if gathering himself, then got out carrying what looked like grocery bags and a guitar case. He didn't go to the front door. Instead, he walked around to the side of the house and knocked 3 times, a pattern like a code. An elderly woman opened the door, and even from this distance, Red could see her face light up. Ace disappeared inside. Red waited in his car, engine off to avoid detection, breath fogging the windshield in the February cold. Was Ace having an affair? Was this some kind of drug situation that could destroy Kiss right before their biggest tour? Nothing made sense. 2.5 hours passed. Red's fingers were numb from the cold when the side door finally opened and Ace emerged. Even from 2 blocks away, Red could see Ace wiping his eyes. The spaceman. The man who commanded stages in front of 100,000 screaming fans. The guitarist who just released the most successful solo album of any Kiss member was crying in the driveway of this forgotten house in one of Connecticut's poorest neighborhoods. The next morning, Red couldn't hold it in any longer. He found Ace alone in his home studio, tuning his Gibson Les Paul. "I followed you last night," Red said quietly, closing the door behind him. Ace's head snapped up, anger flashing in his eyes behind his tinted glasses. "You did what?" His voice was sharp, dangerous. Red had rarely heard Ace use that tone. "I was worried about you, man. Every night you leave, every night you come back looking like you've been through hell. I needed to know you were okay, that you weren't getting yourself into something that could hurt the band." Ace stood up, his jaw tight, hands clenched around the neck of his Les Paul. For a moment, Red thought Ace might actually swing the guitar at him, but then something shifted in the spaceman's expression. The anger melted into exhaustion, and Ace sat back down heavily on his amp, putting his face in his hands. After a long silence, Ace finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Rose, Red. My grandmother. My mom's mom. Everyone who knew Ace knew he'd grown up in the Bronx, that his family had struggled, that his father had worked brutal hours and his mother had cleaned houses. But few people knew just how deeply poverty had carved into Ace Frehley's soul. Before she died in 1972, she made me promise something. She was in the hospital, and she knew she wasn't coming home. The cancer had spread everywhere. She held my hand with these tiny, frail fingers, and she said, 'Paul,' she always called me Paul, never Ace, 'you're going to be rich, more rich than anyone from the Bronx has a right to be. But don't you forget where you came from. Don't forget people like us.'" Ace's voice cracked as he continued, his fingers absently running over the frets of his guitar. "She told me there would always be people struggling just like we did. People who couldn't afford medicine, couldn't pay their electric bills, couldn't eat properly. She made me promise I'd help them, but she said to do it quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no making a show of it. 'That's not charity, Paul,' she said. 'That's just being human. That's just remembering that money don't make you better than anybody. It just makes you lucky.'" Red sat down on the floor beside his friend, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. "That house you saw me at last night," Ace continued, staring at his guitar. "That's Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski. She's 81 years old. Her husband died in 76. He was a factory worker his whole life, and his pension barely covers her medication for her heart condition and diabetes. She's got 3 kids, but they're all struggling themselves, spread across different states, trying to make their own ends meet. She lives alone in that house, and before I found her, She was skipping meals 3 days a week to pay her heating bill. In winter, in Connecticut. Ace looked at Red with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. I met her at a church charity event in '73, right after we started getting radio play. Kiss was doing a photo opportunity thing, me and Gene shaking hands with old folks, and I saw her in the corner. She reminded me so much of my grandmother, Red. Same tired eyes, same way of holding herself up, even when everything's falling apart. Same hands worn down from decades of hard work. I slipped her $200 that day, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. So I went back a week later. No makeup, no press, no other band members, just me and my guitar. And I found out she wasn't the only one. Red listened as Ace revealed what he'd kept hidden for 6 years. Eleanor wasn't the only person Ace visited. There were others scattered across Connecticut and New York. Mr. Thomas Jackson, a Vietnam veteran with no family and scars that went deeper than his skin. The Martinez family, where the father had been injured in a construction accident and couldn't work, leaving his wife to raise 4 kids alone. Mrs. Ruth Anderson, who was raising her 2 grandsons after her daughter died of an overdose. The list went on. A secret constellation of lives Ace Frehley held together with grocery bags and paid bills and hours of his time. I visit them on different nights, Ace explained, his voice steadier now, as if sharing the secret was lifting a weight he'd carried alone for too long. I bring groceries, pay their bills when they can't, fix things around their houses. Sometimes I just sit and play guitar for them, teach them songs, listen to their stories. They don't know I'm Ace Frehley from Kiss. Mrs. Kowalski calls me Paul, just some nice young man with a guitar who helps out. Mr. Jackson thinks I'm Pete, a volunteer from a veterans organization. They don't need to know I'm famous. They don't need to know I just came off a stage in front of 50,000 people. They just need to know somebody cares. They just need to know they're not forgotten. Red felt his throat tighten. Ace, man, why keep it secret? Kiss could start a foundation. You could help thousands of people. This could be incredible publicity. Ace shook his head firmly, something like anger flickering in his expression. You don't get it, do you? If I make this public, what happens? Cameras show up at Mrs. Kowalski's door. Every person in Connecticut with a sad story comes calling. How do I choose who to help? Who deserves it more? The veteran or the single mother? The elderly widow or the disabled kid? And worse, these people, my people, they lose their dignity. They become Ace Frehley's charity cases in the newspaper. They become a photo opportunity for Kiss's image. He stood up and paced, his Les Paul still in his hands like an extension of his body. This way, I keep my promise to Rose. I help people who need it, and they get to keep their pride because they don't know they're being helped by the spacemen. They're just being helped by Paul from the Bronx who remembers what it's like to be hungry. That's what my grandmother wanted. That's what I do. That's who I really am when the makeup comes off. Red learned that night that Ace had been making these midnight drives since Kiss's first taste of success in 1973. Over the years, some of the people he'd helped had passed away, and Ace always sent anonymous donations for funeral expenses through his accountant, marked simply as personal gifts. He kept a small black notebook in his Corvette's glove compartment, with names, addresses, and specific needs written in his careful handwriting. Mrs. Kowalski needs her heart medication on Wednesdays. Check Mr. Jackson's furnace. He forgets to change the filter. Martinez kids need school supplies in September. In 1981, something happened that shook Ace to his core. Red found him sitting in his Connecticut home studio at 3 in the morning, staring at nothing, his Les Paul lying untouched beside him. "She's gone," Ace whispered, his voice hollow. "Mrs. Kowalski died yesterday afternoon. Heart attack." Tears streamed down his face, cutting through the exhaustion and pain. 8 years, Red. 8 years I knew her. And she died thinking I was just some guy named Paul who brought her groceries and played guitar in her living room. She never knew I was the spaceman. She never knew those songs she heard on her grandson's radio were mine. Ace couldn't attend her funeral. The risk of being recognized was too great. The questions it would raise too complicated. But he sent a massive anonymous donation to the funeral home to cover all expenses and ensure she had a proper burial with flowers and dignity. Someone who attended the funeral later mentioned to a local reporter that they'd seen a man in sunglasses and a baseball cap standing at the very back of the church, leaving before anyone could approach him. A single white rose was found on her grave the next day, with a card that read simply, "Thank you for the music lessons, Paul." As Kiss's internal tensions escalated in 1981 and 82, as Ace's drinking became worse, and his relationship with the band deteriorated, the midnight drives became more difficult. His hands shook from alcohol withdrawal. His doctors told him to stop driving, especially at night, especially alone. But Ace couldn't break the promise he'd made to Rose. Red and other members of the security team started quietly following him at a distance, just to make sure he was safe, though Ace never knew they were there. Even in his darkest moments, even when the Space Ace persona was crumbling and Paul Frehley was lost somewhere between fame and addiction, he kept his midnight appointments with the forgotten people of Connecticut. When Ace finally left Kiss in December 1982, one of the first things he did was drive to each of the houses on his list and explain that he'd be moving, that he'd be touring differently now, that he might not be able to visit as regularly. Most of them cried. Not because they were losing Ace Frehley the rock star, they still didn't know who he really was, but because they were losing Paul, their friend who'd shown up every week for years with groceries and guitar songs and genuine kindness. Years later, when Red finally retired from security work in the late 90s, he and Ace met for dinner in New York. Over drinks, Red asked the question that had haunted him for decades. "Do you still do it? The midnight drives?" Ace smiled, a real smile that Red hadn't seen in years. "Different cities now, different people, but yeah, I still do it. I'll always do it. It's the only thing that makes any of this make sense, you know? The stages, the money, the fame, it's all meaningless if you forget where you came from. Rose taught me that. She taught me that being the spaceman on stage is just a job. Being Paul from the Bronx who helps people, that's who I actually am." In 2018, Ace released his autobiography, and in it, he made a brief, vague reference to charitable work he'd done over the years. He didn't provide details, didn't name names, didn't break his promise to Rose. But Eleanor Kowalski's grandson, now a man in his 40s, read that passage and something clicked. He remembered the nice man named Paul who'd visited his grandmother every week when he was a child. He remembered the guitar, the silver Corvette, the tinted glasses. He put two and two together and reached out to Ace's management with a simple message. "Thank you for taking care of my grandmother. She talked about you until the day she died. She called you her angel." That message opened a floodgate. Other people came forward with similar stories. A woman in Bridgeport said a kind man named Pete had paid her father's medical bills for 3 years. She had a photo from 1979, and it was clearly Ace without makeup, sitting on her father's porch with a guitar. A man in Hartford remembered someone named Paul who'd helped his mother after his father died, who'd shown up every week with groceries and stayed to play music. The stories kept coming, a hidden history of kindness that Ace Frehley had kept secret for over 4 decades. Red West, now in his 70s, reflects on those midnight drives with a mixture of sadness and profound respect. Everyone remembers Ace as the spaceman, he says. The makeup, the smoking guitar, the wild solos, the crazy rock and roll lifestyle. But on those midnight drives, he wasn't the spaceman. He was Paul from the Bronx, a grandson keeping a promise to his grandmother. And maybe that's what he'd want to be remembered for most. Not the platinum records or the sold-out shows, but the promise he kept when nobody was watching. The silver Corvette Ace drove on those midnight trips was sold years ago, but Ace kept something from it. In his Connecticut home, in a frame on his studio wall, there's a worn black notebook with faded handwriting. Visitors who see it assume it's old set lists or song ideas. They never know they're looking at evidence of one of the greatest secrets in rock and roll history. The secret of a spaceman who spent his midnights being simply human. One grocery bag and one paid electric bill at a time. Ace Frehley is now in his 70s, still touring, still playing that smoking guitar, still wearing the Space Ace makeup when he takes the stage. But somewhere in whatever city he's in, there's likely a person he's helping. A person who knows him only as Paul or Pete or some nice guy with a guitar. A person who has no idea that the man bringing them groceries is a rock and roll legend. And that's exactly how Ace wants it. Because the promise he made to Rose Frehley wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about remembering that beneath the silver makeup and the pyrotechnics and the screaming crowds, there's just a kid from the Bronx who never forgot where he came from. And in the end, maybe that's the real measure of a life well lived. Not the number of albums sold or stages conquered, but the number of midnight drives taken when nobody was watching. When there were no cameras, no applause, no audience, just a grandson keeping his word to his grandmother. Just the spaceman being human,